President Trump says he's cutting off trade talks with neighbour Canada immediately. It's over plans by the Canadians to enforce a new tax targeting big tech companies, which is predicted to cost them more than $7 billion over the next 5 years.
A $20 billion clean tech deal, and not a single battery will be shipped to the U.S. While Trump escalated his trade war with 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, Ontario quietly signed the biggest battery plant contract in North American history and sent it all to Europe. Every battery produced at the new Volkswagen facility in St. Thomas will power European vehicles, not American ones. This isn't just a business deal, it's a strategic economic pivot and a warning shot across Washington's bow. The U.S. just lost its most loyal ally, and the silence from D.C. proves it. Ontario's economy was once deeply tied to U.S. exports, especially in auto manufacturing. But Trump's 2025 decision to double tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, raising them to 50%, felt like a betrayal. Rather than beg for relief, Ontario struck back with a plan: partner with Europe and leave the U.S. out. And they didn't stop at batteries. Ontario turned to its secret weapon, electricity exports. Millions in New York and Michigan rely on power from Ontario's hydro and nuclear grid. In response to U.S. tariffs, Ontario added a 25% surcharge on electricity sold to the U.S., a move that instantly sent American utilities scrambling. Emergency systems were activated. Warnings were issued. Ontario had made its point. America's energy stability depends on Canadian cooperation. While Washington was still processing Ontario's energy retaliation, Canada's leadership was making bold moves. Prime Minister Mark Carney's first major diplomatic visit wasn't to the U.S., it was to Paris. With President Macron, Carney announced a new strategic partnership focused on climate, trade, and security. Then came the real shocker. Canada paused its $19 billion F-35 jet deal with the U.S. and entered talks with European defense companies. This wasn't just about planes, it was about autonomy. Europe offered technology transfers, local assembly, and stable alliances. Canadian officials made it clear, trust lost in trade spills over into defense. Europe responded rapidly. Billions began flowing into Ontario's clean energy sector. Germany, Norway, and the Netherlands invested in Ontario's wind, hydrogen, and EV infrastructure. In Thunder Bay, a German-backed green hydrogen project secured 500 million euros, money that would have once come from Wall Street. Ontario became Europe's clean energy beachhead in North America. Battery production followed. Dutch and German companies opened EV battery lines and signed contracts with local suppliers, all structured to bypass American markets entirely. Canada's two biggest pension funds also began pulling out of U.S. markets, redirecting billions into Europe. The reason? Europe's policies are stable. America's are chaotic. For Canadian investors, that stability made all the difference. Even trade currencies began shifting. More Canadian companies were billing in euros and yen, rather than U.S. dollars, a small change with huge symbolic weight. It signaled a deliberate move away from America's financial orbit. Ontario's shift was visible in logistics too. Nickel and cobalt mined in the north were now processed and shipped to Europe via Quebec, not through U.S. ports. Rotterdam replaced Detroit as a key export hub. New factories were built to EU specs and workers trained under European labor standards. This wasn't an adaptation, it was a realignment. Infrastructure, energy, and trade, everything was restructured to point east. Ontario was no longer just a supplier for U.S. industry. It was becoming Europe's North American partner. Trump's response came in all caps. On social media, he called Canada's pivot a betrayal of NAFTA and economic terrorism. But it was all bark. The tariffs were already maxed out. Ontario now had the upper hand. The more Trump threatened, the faster Canadian businesses distanced themselves. His own trade war had driven them away, and now he had no tools left to bring them back. Even worse, other provinces were watching. Quebec began exploring similar European partnerships. British Columbia courted Asian and EU investors. If this trend spreads, it could fundamentally redraw North America's trade map. Electric grids might decouple, defense ties could weaken, and American influence across the continent would shrink fast. Europe, meanwhile, seized the moment. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz made several trips to Toronto. Macron welcomed Canadian delegations in Paris. The EU offered preferential market access, deeper integration, and investment incentives. All things the US no longer could guarantee. With Ontario as its anchor, Europe was planting a flag in North America. Europe needs secure access to green tech and minerals. Ontario provides both: wind, hydro, hydrogen, and critical metals. Canada is uniquely positioned to meet those needs, and European investors are flooding in with capital and long-term contracts, and this wasn't just about profit. It was about strategic positioning, and America was being left out of its own hemisphere. U.S. defense and energy firms began reporting a loss of access to Canadian markets. Deals once assumed to be automatic were now rerouted to Europe. U.S. financial firms saw billions in Canadian investment quietly exit for EU-based portfolios. The real shock? This shift was working. Ontario's economy thrived under its new partners. European companies set up long-term operations. Canadian pension funds saw higher returns and fewer policy risks. Politicians weren't posturing. They were forming alliances that could last decades. For decades, America's dominance meant Canadian alternatives were theoretical. Trump made them practical. Ontario proved that success didn't require U.S. approval, just different partners. And once supply chains, investments, and trust move elsewhere, they don't just bounce back. This wasn't a phase, it was a structural transformation. Ontario didn't just shift away from America. It built systems that don't need America. Ontario's realignment is more than regional. It signals a multipolar future for North America, one where Europe, Asia, and America compete for influence. Canada now plays the role of bridge, not subordinate. Quebec may align more with Asia. British Columbia may deepen Pacific trade. The U.S. is no longer the only game in town, and if Ontario's example spreads, the world's longest undefended border might become its deepest economic fault line. The geopolitical impact? Massive. Energy security becomes political, not geographic. Defense cooperation becomes conditional. Economic trust becomes optional. And through it all, Europe gains a permanent foothold in North America. Ontario's pivot is a blueprint, and it's working. Mexico is now exploring European alternatives. Even some U.S. states are quietly seeking direct EU partnerships to bypass Washington's volatility. Once the world learns it can prosper without U.S. permission, there's no going back. Trump's rage won't reverse this shift. Tariffs won't rebuild trust. And America's economic dominance won't hold if allies prefer someone else. The question isn't whether the U.S. can stop Ontario's pivot. It can't. The question is, will America learn from this or repeat the same mistakes until everyone else walks away? Because right now, Ontario just proved something terrifying. The world doesn't need U.S. approval to move on. And once that realization sets in, the era of American economic supremacy may not just be challenged, it may be over.